introduce Taylor Jones, Dr. Taylor Jones. He is an atmospheric scientist, a professor in the Earth Commons, and also an engineer. His work is on greenhouse gas modeling and studying greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, as well as the role of plants in regulating temperatures and carbon and water cycling. He has a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from the University of Maryland, a PhD from Harvard in Environmental Science and Engineering. And in between that, he spent some time building lasers for NASA to study aerosols in the atmosphere and clouds. All right.
Yeah.
Take it away, Taylor.
Thanks everybody for being here. So my talk today is going to be on solar-induced fluorescence, probably a topic no one's super familiar with, particularly solar fluorescence in croplands. I gave it an ambitious subtitle, How the Invisible Glow of Plants Can Be Measured from Space and What That Means for the Future of Agriculture. Another good title for this talk could have been Why I'm So Obsessed with This One Patch of Land in Oklahoma. I'm going to talk a lot about this one piece of land. It's a piece of land that's about 25 kilometers wide, 25 kilometers tall, roughly the size of the Beltway for DC. And we're going to spend many, many slides staring at this patch of ground. But we'll get into that when we get there. But the first outline for today's talk, so we're going to talk about a little background. We're going to talk about NDVI, the current state of precision agriculture and remote sensing, so how farmers are using remote sensing and other cool technologies to help improve their yields. We're going to introduce a new concept called solar-induced fluorescence. I'm going to talk about some of our field experiments using SIF measured from towers. We're going to talk about how far we can currently push SIF measurements that we make from space with satellites. And then I'll finish up with my conclusions, hopes, and dreams. Okay, great. So first, a few slides of background. So we're starting talking about normalized differential vegetation index. And if any of my remote sensing students are here, but this is kind of when we talk about measuring vegetation from space, this is a number that we talk about quite a lot, NDVI. And what is it? So we're going to start by looking at some data from the Terra satellite, specifically the MODIS instrument on the Terra satellite. And if we look at this patch of ground in Oklahoma, and if we look at one image from MODIS, this is what a 500-meter resolution, so there's each of those pixels, it's about 500 meters by 500 meters, what the resolution of that image looks like. And this is a red, green, blue composite image. So think if you're just taking a picture with your camera, it's an RGB image. This is what that image looks like from space. You're probably thinking, oh, the image on both sides looks a lot better. But that's an image that's probably a composite of a bunch of aircraft imagery and other stuff and private satellites, and not something that we can use readily like these other scientific instruments. So we can look at a red, green, blue image of this area. This is from April 2019. And even though it's a little blurry, you can probably pick out, there's some green areas, there's some brown areas, right? The green areas are probably active crops, the brown areas probably not, right? So April in Oklahoma, this is winter wheat season, right? But you can see there's a lot of different crops going on there. But usually in remote sensing, we're not that interested in red, green, blue imagery. We like to look at these different colors separately, right? So for instance, we could look at the red channel, right? So this is just the red values, red reflectance, so how much red light is getting reflected from each one of these pixels on the ground. And what can you see? Well, inactive crops, the brown areas, very high reflectance. Active crops, very low reflectance, right? And this is because plants like red light, right? That's what they want to use for photosynthesis. They're not going to reflect a lot, right? So that makes sense, right? We can also look at the near infrareds. This is around 800 nanometers. This is a very useful wavelength, even though we can't see it. It's really useful in remote sensing. This is a wavelength that plants do not like, so they tend to reflect a lot of it, right? So where we have active crops, you can see very high reflectances, something like 50%. Inactive crops, very low reflectances, right? So if active vegetation is showing low reflectance in the red, high reflectance in the infrared, we can calculate this really useful thing called NDVI. So that's the normalized differential vegetation index. It's basically the infrared minus the red, right? So you're going to get a really high number where you have lush active vegetation. And this is kind of the gold standard metric for doing anything related to vegetation from space. It's used a lot in studies of forests and carbon, ecosystem health, deforestation, modeling and observations, biomass estimates, wildfire recovery. This is a year of MODIS NDVI data for Brazil. And for agriculture, this has also been heavily adopted and is getting more and more adopted, right? So here's journal articles from a meta-analysis review that came out this year showing, we're getting increasingly large numbers of publications that are written about something very specific, how NDVI relates to wheat yields, right? It's very specific. And there's lots of different ways that farmers, small farmers, large-scale farmers are trying to integrate these different types of data sets into their decision-making process. So when to plant, what to plant, how to water, how to fertilize, right? They're trying to get as much data as they can to help with these things. And in general, they like to say that NDVI can be used to predict yield. And under some situations, that works out pretty well. On other situations, not so much. This is from that same meta-analysis where they looked at a couple dozen countries and measurements and models made. And you can see some of these countries get a little bit better relationship than others, right? So definitely some promise there, but it's not the end-all be-all for helping our farming situation. Right? It's not the end of the talk. Okay. So how rapidly is this stuff getting adopted, right? So here's a 2019 survey that Purdue did from their College of Agriculture, where they interviewed agricultural dealerships, so people that are selling equipment, seeds, other technologies to farmers. And this is a way too complicated graph, but if you look at the kind of the light blue line, that's satellite and aerial imagery, right? So more and more dealers are offering these types of tools to farmers in the United States. But if you look a little further in that survey, you get this other really big chart that shows the profitability of these different services according to the retailers, right? And you can see some of these things are super profitable, right? So up at the top, so variable fertilizer application, right? So having a really smart machine that's able to fertilize different parts of your field with different amounts based on certain data, right? That ends up being really profitable. But if you look down towards the bottom here, satellite imagery, drone imagery, mostly not even breaking even, right? So we're not really at the point where satellite data is really saving the day when it comes to helping farmers, right? And there's some reasons for this. There's some technical issues, but even if we just look at NDVI, there's some issues with it. So it's affected by clouds and aerosols, saturates when you have dense vegetation. Soil reflectivity is a big deal. And as you can imagine, when you have farms, your soil quality is also something that you're varying. And maybe most importantly, the signal tends to lag behind plant stress. So we want to have a measurement of plants that is capturing stress very quickly, right? If you're underwatering your crops, if you're under fertilizing your crops, we want to see that as soon as we can, right? And what we've seen in experiments is NDVI, it could be days, it could be weeks, where it looks good in the NDVI, but there's stress happening. So we're trying to find something else, right? We keep looking for a better thing we can measure from space. And one of those things is solar-induced fluorescence. Okay, big term. So solar-induced fluorescence, it's one of several energy dissipation pathways that absorbed sunlight can have in plants. So basically, as sunlight hits a leaf, a photon hits a leaf, that photon can do several things. It can do photosynthesis. That's great. We like that in plants. It can be reflected. It can be absorbed as heat, or it can be absorbed and then re-emitted at another wavelength, fluorescence. And in general, an active plant will convert about 1% of photosynthetic active radiation into SIF. And this is a really great diagram of SIF partitioning, or of PAR partitioning in a leaf. This actually comes from a paper by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Julia Mars, who's visiting today from NIST. And this diagram was such a big deal of her PhD thesis that when she graduated, our other friend made her this cake. So that's see it in cake form, see it in graph form. So anyway, SIF, a promising other thing we can measure. And measuring SIF, it's a little more complicated. SIF is this broad spectrum signal. However, if we are pretty good at spectroscopy, we can see that it's going to infill certain parts of the solar spectrum in a way we're actually able to measure it with high resolution spectrometers. And so a few years ago, when we really got into SIF, I'm an engineer, I decided I'll make my own SIF instrument, right? Try this thing out, see how good this stuff really is. So I was told to do this by my postdoc advisor in 2019. I was supposed to build it in 2020. The world fell apart, right? So I took everything out of the lab, drove from Boston to my mom's house in Maryland, because I had a little kid at the time, and turned her dining room into the lab where I built this SIF instrument and tested it in her yard. So all the neighbors would drive by and see this weird mechanical robot sensor thing moving around and got a lot of funny looks. That was my son Ezra at the time, my lab assistant. So we built this SIF instrument, and we needed somewhere to go and test it. The perfect place to test this was, at the time, an experiment I was part of at NIST up here in Gaithersburg. It was called the Forested Optical Reference for the Evaluation of Sensor Technology. And if you're good at acronyms, you can read that that says FOREST. So this is the FOREST experiment in Gaithersburg. And this was a really cool plot of land, 100 meters by 100 meters. And we filled it with all kinds of cool sensors, respiration chambers, sap flow sensors, remote sensing equipment, looking at it from a nearby building. And my colleagues and I did these really cool modeling and measurement experiments where we measured things like how much carbon is this whole plot of land sucking up on any given day, things like that. So it was the perfect place to test this, this SIF sensor. And track of time here. And so we thought, how do we want to test this, right? Well, the thing I really wanted to test was, how does this measure stress, right? It's cool if I can get a signal, but how's that signal going to change if the plants are stressed out? And we started looking at trees. Maybe we'll stress the trees out. And then we decided, you know, trees are kind of complicated. Their geometry is really weird. We should measure grass. And maybe grass isn't that cool, but if you're designing experiments for remote sensing, grass is kind of one of your easier things to measure. So we did this experiment where we grew a bunch of pallets of grass, all identical. Maryland long fescue, I think, was the actual species. So we grew these, you know, like 1 meter by 1 meter pallets. And then we had this experiment where we had the SIF spectrometer up on the roof, and we rotated these pallets in and out of the field of view of the spectrometer. And some of these pallets were our control group. Some of them we droughted, so we induced a water stress. And some of them we sprayed with this chemical called ABA. And what ABA does is it shuts down the stomates in the leaves. It shuts down photosynthesis very rapidly. And so we wanted to see, okay, so how does SIF change when we do this? And how do traditional things like NDVI change? Here's the results of that. So what we found is, so the first column here is A net. So that's the amount of photosynthesis that's happening. We measured that at the leaf level, painstakingly putting little blades of grass in this little sensor that measures photosynthesis. I didn't do that, somebody else did. I just sat on the roof watching stuff. And so you can see there that with our ABA treatment, percent difference from control, you can see instantly shut down what was happening, right? For NDVI, which, again, our gold standard metric of this stuff from space, you could say that even with ADNA, which immediately shut down photosynthesis, no change on the second day. Day 2, day 3, we started to see some stuff. With the water stress, you could see photosynthesis slowly dropping. However, NDVI, not really sensing the water stress at all. But SIF, the last column, you see we do see that immediate drop after applying ABA and a drop due to the water stress. So this was a really exciting result for us. This showed us, okay, SIF is able to detect stress days earlier than NDVI. And when you're planning a farm or something like that, days matter, right? If there's an infestation or something going on with your fields, it's really helpful to know this stuff as soon as you possibly can, right? So this made us really want to study SIF. And so I built some more of these sensors and helped some friends build some. We built one, put it up at Harvard Forest. We have a Harvard Forest person here, which surprised me. So that's on a tower at Harvard Forest in Massachusetts. And then we built a few with a colleague of mine at UC Davis who was looking at different types of crops, particularly grapevines. And we wrote a few papers using his version of the instrument on this tall tower here. This was a mobile instrument, the tower spectrometer on wheels for investigating frequent time series, also known as T-Swift. So we wrote the T-Swift paper in 2023. This paper made the school newspaper. Taylor Swift becomes a phenotype monitoring machine. If you think that that's grown worthy, the previous name of this experiment was the breathing ecosystem, y'all, optical near surface camera, also known as Beyonce, which, yikes. And he put my name in there. I don't know why he did that. So lots of experiments are now doing these with these instruments. We're learning a lot of the intricacies of what affects SIF measurements at different scales, right? We've been doing recently lab experiments. So this is mostly work being done by Jonathan Dooley here, building these machines to look at things like, how does the angle that we're looking at the canopy, yes, even grasses have canopies, right? How does the angle that we're looking at the canopy affect our SIF measurements? And turns out it does affect them. It's probably something we can account for, but you have to do a lot of this kind of lab experiment to do it. And we also needed little grasses to grow this, to do this. Luckily, we have a garden here as part of Earth Commons. So these clover samples were grown by Charlotte, our Hoya harvest garden. She was like, yeah, I can grow grasses for you. So not only are we really pushing the measurement of SIF and how we can use it, some companies are kind of attacking this problem from the other way. There's a startup also in Davis, California called Interplant that's teamed up with John Deere that's actually genetically modifying crops to glow under certain conditions, to fluoresce under certain conditions. They're splicing in proteins from jellyfish, right? So I promised the jellyfish people I'd show you. So they're using the green fluorescent protein to actually light up these plants. I don't know how you feel about GMOs. I don't know how you feel about GMOs using parts of jellyfish, but it's a cool technology. Okay, so that was the tower stuff. What does SIF look like from space, right? It's cool to put something on a tower. If you get an instrument in space, now it can go over the whole world. You can get frequent repeat visits, all for one big upfront investment, but relatively little kind of investment per measurement, right? If you get yourself a satellite. So I'm going to talk about a couple instruments that measure SIF, arguably two of the best up there, OCO2 and OCO3. I will not be answering questions about OCO1. Do not bring it up. OCO2 has a pixel size on the ground. Remember, those MODIS pixels were 500 meter by 500 meter. These are much bigger, right? So 1.3 by 2 kilometer. It's in a sun synchronous orbit for anyone who cares. It's been up there since 2014. This is a big deal about this instrument. We have a decade of measurements from this sensor, which is super useful. And it typically measures in a couple of different ways, usually in what we call nadir mode, glint mode, also does this thing called target mode. There's another version of the instrument on the International Space Station that does a different type of measurement called an area mapping mode, but with similar resolution. So what do those data look like? Well, if we look at some of this data over Boston, which is where I was before I was here, this is what that data looks like. So on the left, we have nadir mode, and nadir mode just means that your satellite's flying overhead and it's looking straight down. And so as it goes over the ground, it's only looking at what's right beneath it at any one moment in time. And it's got a few pixels wide and just kind of pushes that broom as it goes. OCO3 works a little differently. It has this area mapping mode, meaning as it flies by, it scans, and it does another scan, and does another scan. So it kind of builds up a little more of a two-dimensional image of SIF on the ground, right? And these data products are super useful. They're really great at things like constraining global vegetative output. But if we want to do things like study cities at the neighborhood scale, or if we want to study farms at the farm scale, right? This type of data is not going to do it. It's too coarse, right? So what do we do? So that brings me to the question, is there anything we can do to improve the resolution of this data, to get smaller pixels, right? Can we go from coarse pixels to smaller pixels? And when I first started tackling this problem, of course, I thought of the world experts in this type of image processing, CSI. Right? Because what happens in CSI, right? They get a grainy image, and then someone goes enhance, and then the computer magically just enhances the image, right? And so this is what, effectively, this is what we want to do, right? We've got this coarse pixel image, and I go, that's not good enough. Zoom in and enhance. There's no one else in the room, so I have to figure out how to do that. And this is a little bit science fiction, but there actually are things to do this, especially nowadays. There's a lot of machine learning techniques that can essentially do this, right? And we've done that with SIF, right? So there's been several different methods for downscaling SIF using different neural network techniques and other machine learning techniques. This is one that was published by my friends at Technical University of Munich, where they were able to download SIF from another satellite, Tropomi, to 500-meter resolution. And they had a very clever system for doing this. But ultimately, one really important thing to note is that this model is trained and uses MODIS data as its input. Well, if you're bringing in MODIS data, if you're bringing in that red and infrared data from MODIS, you're essentially bringing in NDVI into your model. So if I think that NDVI is lagging, and if it's not telling me what I want it to do, this isn't going to be the model that I want to use, right? This is not how I want to do my downscaling. So what else can we do? Well, there's one more mode of operation for the satellite. OCO2 does this thing called target mode, where instead of flying over an area and just staring straight down, it will pick a point on the ground and it will move the camera up and down, side to side, as it's approaching it, as it's leaving it, to try to cover that patch of ground with as many pixels as possible. And typically they do this for a few set calibration targets and some interesting CO2 targets. They don't do this all the time because it uses up a lot of your orbit, right? Think in nadir mode, I can see the whole side of the country as I'm moving, but if I'm going to point ahead to a target and then point back to it, I'm chewing up a lot of my orbit. Plus it costs time to put it in this mode and get it back out. It's a costly operation to do. You don't like doing it a ton, right? So in general, they only look at a few sources. And in general, you just kind of have to deal with what they do, or you can email Greg. And so sometimes I email Greg, and Greg will humor me and give me a target if I ask really nicely. Greg's a nice guy. Okay. Greg works at NASA. Yeah. Okay. So what do these target modes look like, right? So this is just outlines of those pixels over Boston, and the brown outlines behind it are the tropomi pixels, right? Just another instrument showing you the different scales here. And you can see that these pixels overlap each other in really interesting non-linear ways, right? If you think about putting a dense grid underneath of this, each OCO pixel is some linear combination of all the subcells underneath of it, and it's probably some unique linear combination of it. Well, if you're really into math, this is a really cool math problem, right? If you're really into Bayesian statistics, this lends itself really well to a Bayesian inverse framework. If you don't know what that is, that's okay, I'm not going to get into it. But this just shows you, if I pick a really fine field underneath, this is how many of those soundings overlap each of these pixels. And you can see it's quite a lot, 40, 50, 60 pixels overlapping each one of these data points. This gives me a lot of confidence that I'm going to be able to get information at this smaller scale by applying this method. And sure enough, when we do, we see really cool stuff, right? So if you know Boston, you'll know that the bright area down here is kind of the leafy suburbs. The darker area over to the right is more of the urban core. This lines up pretty well with other maps we have of vegetation. Lots of people study in Boston, so there's lots of great data, lots of great GIS data of different types. And we can even pick out things like, let's pull out where all the golf courses are, or the cemeteries, right? This is data that was taken in late summer, so a lot of the grass was starting to die off. And you can see that things like golf courses actually light up pretty bright on this scale when we do this. This isn't unique to Boston. We've done this in Toronto, so we can downscale Toronto. And you can see here that this one really bright spot, we were like, oh, what's there? We zoom in, and it's a huge golf course, right? Same if we look down at the southern part of the city, we can see to the left where there's parks and golf courses, and then to the urban core on the right, we see that big difference in SIF, right? So this is cool. This is like giving us a lot of confidence in our technique. And we've shown that downscaling SIF over urban targets, it's a great way of understanding neighborhood scale, variability, and plant productivity. And we've got really cool plans on where we want to take that research in different cities around the planet. But one problem is this only works where we have those targets. And where do we have those targets? Well, only a few sites and wherever Greg lets us go. Right? And so when I looked at this and I thought, okay, where else can I look at this? I said, you know what? Let me pull all the data we have for 10 years from OCO2. And let me look at every single target mode sounding, every single pixel, and see where they are. And I made this plot. And sometimes it takes you like 8 hours to make one plot. This is that plot, right? But I'm real proud of it, right? So this is 10 years of OCO data. In fact, when they had their 10-year anniversary, they made a special sticker. This is every target mode pixel ever. So sounding is the same thing as pixel. You can see there's 300,000 pixels on the right there. And if you look at this, some of these are cities, right? There's LA, there's Mexico City, there's Seoul. But the number one spot is Lamont, Oklahoma. And I saw this and I thought, where the hell is Lamont, Oklahoma? But there's a perfectly good reason why this instrument stares at Lamont, Oklahoma all the time. And that's because of a thing called TCON. So the main purpose of OCO2 is to measure CO2. Actually wasn't really designed to be a SIF instrument. That was kind of a bonus thing that it can do. And we could talk about CO2 measurements all day long if you want. But TCON is a way of measuring CO2 in the atmosphere from the ground. It's a very high precision instrument. And so there's a network of these instruments. They're in trailers scattered around the world. And they make excellent targets for OCO as validation, right? So it looks down, it says, I'm getting 405 parts per million. TCON looks up and says, I'm getting 406 parts per million. And then the scientists try to figure out why there's a difference, right? So it's constantly hitting these validation targets. And it does that target mode to try to average together a whole bunch of numbers to get the best possible number we can from the satellite, right? And they've been doing this, again, for a decade, and nobody's really thought, well, what else is in that data, right? But I looked at this and I thought, oh, this is pretty cool. There's been 100 separate targets of this over the years, and it gets pretty good coverage, right? And it's about, again, a 25 kilometer by 25 kilometer area. What does that area really look like on the ground? So I pulled up the USDA cropland data layer, and a couple really interesting things, right? So one, it's pretty much all cropland. Okay, cool, I guess I'll study crops now, right? Two, it's pretty diverse, right? There's kind of a lot of different crops there. There's a lot of different colors going on. And also, the things aren't all grouped together, right? It's not like all of the wheats over here, all of the soys over here, right? In order to figure out signals from different crops, I'm gonna have to get a pretty good downscaling technique to do this. Also, 2015 to 2019, these are not the same image, right? There's crop rotation. Farmers are changing what they're planting here, which again, from a math standpoint that's a really great way to test my system, right? If I analyze this cropland data a little more, everything from here on out is going to be just from that one patch of land, right? So if I look at that year over year, we can see the most common crop is winter wheat. There's also a lot of pasture and grassland, and then depending on the year, quite a bit of soy, right? Also some double cropping of winter wheat and soy. We also see that 30 to 40% of the pixels change crop type every year, right? So this is your crop rotation. This is, again, kind of a lot, right? Kind of a lot to ask for your method. So what do we expect SIF to look like in this place? Well, if we look at winter wheat and soy, two of the big crops that are happening here, and I'm not really a farmer, I didn't know a lot of this. I had to look all this up on the Oklahoma State University Extension School website. But in general, you're planting winter wheat in September, October, and then it's growing February, March, and you're harvesting somewhere around May and June. Soy has the sort of opposite schedule. You're planting May, June, you're harvesting September, October, right? So if you think about what your SIF signal should look like, in places where you have winter wheat, you should expect to see a peak in the spring from SIF. And for soy, you should expect to see a peak in the fall, right? Pretty simple. Okay, so what does it look like? Well, first, let's bring back our old friend SIFnet, right? Again, 500-meter resolution, uses MODIS data, but it is a really nice model, right? And what's nice about this model is they produce a new data point every 2 weeks, right? So I can take, that little box there is my area around Lamont. I can average together every SIF pixel from SIFnet every 2 weeks and just see what's the overall SIF picture look like over time. And for the few years that we have SIFnet data, we get data that seems to make sense, right? So particularly if you look at 2019, we get the two peaks we're expecting. We get a strong peak in the spring from winter wheat, and we get a smaller peak, there's less soy, right? We get a smaller peak in the fall. So it sort of makes sense, right? So that's great, they're all in there, but I really want to separate the two, right? And I want to do that using my downscaling technique. It's not using any other data, right? So I don't get to put a lot of inputs, but one input I do get to put in is the grid that I downscale to. And this is a choice that I have to make. And there's a little bit to think about here, right? So we start with our basic area. One option would be, well, we can use the MODIS grid, right? 500-meter resolution, we could probably get to that. But if you look, these MODIS pixels, they're kind of these weird parallelograms that don't really quite line up with where our crops seem to naturally delineate, right? I look at this map and it kind of looks like a grid already. So why don't I exploit that to try to get the best that I can do, right? So how did I do it? So I started with downloading some GIS layers. Anyone from my GIS class here? Yeah, cool, yeah, great. Yeah, so download some GIS layers, right? So I added major roadways. I downloaded minor roadways. These are about 1 mile by 1 mile apart. And then if you look at that grid, you can see, well, the plots are sort of subdivided in 4 in there. So I just took this grid and just divided everything by 4. And one of the really fun things I've discovered about working with data in Oklahoma is that some of the websites have really funny, modest names. For instance, all of this data came from okmaps.org. They're not just okay, these are great maps. You know, I think they're really selling themselves short. okmaps.org, great maps, no complaints. And if we zoom in, you know, this grid really seems to give us our best chance at capturing pixel by pixel level variability, right? This does seem to be where things naturally delineate. However, there's still a bit of variability in each of these pixels, right? And if I actually analyze within these the dominant crop type, I still find that a lot of these pixels only have about 30% of the pixel as the dominant crop type, right? So this isn't as amazingly well stratified as I hoped it would be. We push through, right? One thing we can do is say, hey, let's just ignore any pixel where I have a super heterogeneous pixel, right? There's like 10% of everything in there. I'm not going to try to solve for that pixel. We can ignore that one, right? So we can throw out some, have some lower threshold there. And if we do that, if we start the downscaling with this new map that I created, you can see we have tons of overlapping pixels, right? Which really gives us confidence in the information content we're going to be able to bring into this downscaled system, right? We have, in some cases, over 100 pixels overlapping at these different scales. And so what's it look like? Well, we did it. Actually, I dually run this one for me. And we can see pretty interesting things in the SIF, right? So there's different knobs in our inversion that we can tweak. One is the smoothing parameter. You can see with different smoothing parameters, it smooths the data, nothing surprising there. But there's clearly some pixel to pixel, there's some structure here that we think has some meaning. But the question is, how does this look when we look at SIF for each crop type and each pixel, right? And here's what we found. So comparing SIFnet and downscaled OCO2 SIF for the year of 2019, broken out by crop type. And I didn't know if this would work, and man, did it work, right? So what do we see? We see winter wheat having more or less the signal we'd expect. There's probably a lot of bleed in here, right? There's probably a lot of some soy and other crops getting into that signal. So I'm not super surprised to see another fall peak in the winter wheat. But the double cropping plot makes sense. The soy plot, again, it's got some bleed in it, right? But we definitely see a stronger fall peak in the soy. As far as I know, this is the first time anybody's been able to pull this level of detail from SIF from space, right? And we first did this, I don't know, 12 days ago. And even if we look at different smoothing factors and we plot this as box plots, you can see that there are differences, you know, winter wheat versus soy at different parts of the year. But if you know how to read box plots well, you'll go, oh, these are not super tight. And you're right, they're not, right? There is a lot of noise here. There's a lot of variation here, which tells me that on a 25-kilometer scale, I can pick out what different crops are doing. What I can't do is say, that farm over there is doing this. I can't do it, right? I don't have that level of explaining power in my data, in my model to do that. And in fact, if you look at other years, that was 2019 before, for 2020, this starts to look real bad. But then you realize that we didn't actually have targets every time we wanted them, right? So it's not like we get a target every 2 weeks, right? It's sort of whenever the weather cooperates and there's not other more important things and somebody else didn't call Greg, right? You know, there's reasons why we don't get targets all the time. But this is the satellite that's up there now. Where do we go from here, right? So the future of SIF from space, the next mission, it's going to improve our ability to get this stuff, is a mission from the European Space Agency called FLEX, the Fluorescence Explorer, I think. Scheduled to launch mid next year. We'll see. They keep pushing it back. Pretty common. 300-meter resolution, which that sounds pretty awesome, right? Based on everything we've been looking at here, right? 150-kilometer wide swaths. So that's kind of the width of that push broom that's going to be going over. It's pretty wide, right? So a lot of data. And we're going to get a new piece of data everywhere on Earth every 27 days, which, you know, if I'm trying to sell this as my precision agriculture tool, that's probably not good enough. But for trying to start to understand this stuff, this is a huge leap forward, right? Super excited for Flex. Okay. So, conclusions. One, downscaled OCO2 target mode data can be used to differentiate SIF from different crop types, even without introducing other data sets, right? I didn't put anything else in there telling it what was underneath. It was able to figure out differences with different crop types. However, the irregularity of how much we have data means that it's likely we're not catching peak values every year. The dream of field level spaceborne SIF for farmers and scientists lives on, but we're not there yet, right? And maybe not with Flex, but maybe the next one, right? But this also gives a cool question of, can this method of putting something in a target mode, which in a lot of ways can be cheaper than designing an instrument that just natively measures high resolution, right? Can you design a system that utilizes this to downscale data in this way? Is that a useful way to design a future mission for measuring all kinds of stuff that's hard to measure? And with that, I want to say thanks and give a big shout out to a lot of my collaborators, sort of too numerous to name, but here's a lot of the organizations that they're all part of. And I'm happy to take any questions on any of this. So thanks, everybody. No idea how that was with time. Oh, perfect. It's like a plan. Yeah.
So it looked like where you were lacking the targets in the second plot you showed with the time series of each crop type.
Yeah.
It looked like it was still lining up with SIFNet pretty well where the data existed. And like the line draws through where there would be a peak, but like, have you thought about ways to infill that time series that would be legitimate or?
Yeah, absolutely, right. It's really tempting to just say, oh, we know what April should be, right? It's up there,
Sure.
Right? But again, any data set that we bring in, it's not the SIF, right? It's not this thing that we know responds to stress, right? It's something else, right? So sure, we can pull in other models, we can pull in weather models, for different PFTs and all this other stuff and simulate what it should be, but I'm really hesitant to do that unless I have a real good reason to.
Is there a ton of that kind of experimental setup that you have to do in order to identify the SIF properties for different crop types? Like, would it be really burdensome to try to add a bunch of different plants to that model?
No, people are doing it. I mean, it's about as tedious as any agriculture experiment, right? So Troy Magny, the guy with the goofy acronyms, right? A lot of his experiments are, let's put up a tower in the middle of an experimental farm that has 100 different plots, right? And either with different species or different phenotypes of the same species, right? And, kind of meticulously collect a lot of data and see how those numbers respond. So people are doing it, but it's tedious and takes years to get good data for it.
Do you need to be, can you solve for these values not on a grid? Does it have to be gridded data that you're?
No, so essentially this is not gridded, right? And actually, if you look at it, like the way the roads work, it's mostly a grid, but then there's a river and it turns a little bit, right? So these are all, polygons that it's solving to. If they're largely different areas, you kind of have to think about that math-wise for weighting and what that means, or if you've got any sort of covariant structure that deals with distance, You'd have to think about that, but no, it doesn't have to be a grid.
And then I have a follow-up question of, have you figured out how many different pictures you need to get in order to be able to get the kind of resolution you're mapping? Like, is it oversampling in its targeted pictures or?
Yeah, we haven't done that explicitly. I don't know if Russell has.
Looked into it a bit, but
Yeah, we've certainly had those conversations and we've run kind of pseudo experiments of holding out certain sets of pixels and then reintroducing them and seeing how much, you know, our data changes. There might be some of that in his paper that's about to
yeah,
be submitted.
the K-fold that he does.
Yeah, I don't, there's no like amazing number that
Yeah.
comes to mind about all of it, but yeah, you can run all that stuff.
From a pragmatic data perspective, would the ideal be to be able to infer what crops are on the ground based on OCO2 data? Is that the
Yeah, so, you know, it's not that exciting to build an instrument that says, there's a soybean farm. Right? You know, there's other ways of identifying where a soybean farm is, right? In fact, I'm using that as one of my, you saw the cropland data layer, right? So the goal isn't really to say like, oh, that's where soy is. The goal is to say, oh, let's look at that soybean field. How stressed out is it? How productive is it being, right? That's the dream, right? And this is a middle step to try to get us there.
So the tower mounted instruments tell you that.
Yes.
I have colleagues who've done stuff on different things with, it's not my area of expertise at all, but using drone technology as a mount. Why towers and not, is the instrumentation not, I mean, is it too sensitive to be able to do that, or?
No, drones are great. We put them on drones. We just bought a drone. Yeah, and we have colleagues that do it. Towers are great because they don't need batteries to stay up, right? And for a lot of these things, we want to get, you know, diurnal cycles and we want to go day after day, right? So we want to get these really long data samples. And when you haven't, you know, this instrument I designed, you can point it and you can program where it looks, and it's got a small field of view, right? So I can say, look at that field, that field, that field.
So this doesn't matter in this case.
Well, you have to correct for it.
Okay.
Right? Julia could tell you about struggling through that math for a while, right? But you also kind of have to deal with that on the drone, right? But certainly, we have a colleague at the USDA Beltsville campus who she's like the master of drone versions of this and gets really amazing data, you know, using that technique. But, you know, you can only fly your drone for X number of minutes at a time, and then it's a little more labor intensive. Yeah.
Have you characterized the different, like the separated error by like downscaling error versus satellite error? Different sources, do you have like a separation of different sources of error in this analysis?
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about using a pretty standard Bayesian inverse framework is that, you know, your error structures are, you know, you use this equation, right? And, you know, we have NASA's reported error in the SIF measurement, right? Which slots pretty easily into there. There's some other errors like pointing error, right? So how well does that pixel really line up there? Not really accounting for that yet, right? So we do get, I don't have them here, but we do get error bars on our results, you know, based on our posterior error covariance and all of that. Yep. Yep.
This is really cool. I was wondering, so it seems like the SIF is, you said, able to detect stress days earlier. And I was wondering if you thought that this could at some point be applied to, I don't know, grassland protected areas or things like that, where like the days really do matter for stress of different ecosystems, for protected area management and that kind of work.
Yeah, it's a great point. We haven't looked at grasslands. However, again, we've studied grass and it's great. It's like a really strong, clean signal. So I would be very pumped to look at grasslands that have less structure than trees and other stuff. So I'm sure it could be done.
I too am very excited for Flex, and maybe I should know this, but does it have any fun targeting or similar modes planned for that sensor?
If they do, they haven't told people.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that
Yeah.
was out yet.
I don't know. And I'm less cozy with the Europeans than I am with NASA, right? So I don't really know a lot about the mission itself. I'm just kind of a fanboy waiting for it.
So, and you picked the spot that has the biggest amount of data, right?
Yeah.
Would you have interesting results if you looked at, lesser detected places?
Yeah, there's I don't know how many target places we have on the planet. 30?
38 at a time.
Okay, 38. So 38 different places on the planet. Some of them have a few targets, some have a lot. Most of them tend to be in pretty boring places because that's where they put these reference targets, right? So Railroad Valley, California, like out in the desert, right? That's probably not going to be a super interesting place to study. But some of these are in cities. One's over Europe's largest coal power plant. Like there's different things that make them interesting for either CO2 or SIF. But we kind of started with the biggest one. And also it's a lot easier to study places in America because you have a lot better other data sets, right? So the other data I can pull in for this makes the problem a lot easier than if there was equivalent farmland in some other country.
I'm curious about scale and sort of feasibility for like individual farmers where like space is cool, satellites are cool,
Yeah.
but you're clearly capable of building these in your mom's house.
Yeah.
And deploying instruments. Like what is the application to using SIF on sort of like an instrument, like much finer scale basis? If I'm my own farmer, I'm not concerned about what's happening 3 farms over. I just want to know what's happening on
Yeah.
that farm.
Yeah, that's also happening, right? So you look at, kind of the big precision ag companies, right? You look at what John Deere's doing, right? They're kind of playing around with, let's put one of these on a combine, It doesn't make sense at the farm scale to do, everyone's got their own instrument on this stuff. There's other instruments that people do that for. That might happen. But those are kind of 2 avenues that should get explored in parallel, right? The thing that I really love about the satellite stuff is, sure, we can help out farmers in America, but I can use all of this to help out farmers all over the world, right? And, in places where maybe they could use a little more help, right? So yeah, they're both great. They should both be pursued, but it's not a common thing.
Is SIF a good measure for stress in plants other than grass? Do you know, like for example, forests?
Julia?
Depends on who you ask. I think in
Yeah.
the satellite scale, there have been a bunch of studies published saying they can at least get at drought stress.
Yeah.
If you go to finer scales, maybe not.
Yeah, it's not a slam dunk, right? It's probably doable, but it's a little trickier.